This is Regenerative Skills, the podcast helping you to learn the skills and solutions to create an abundant and connected future. I'm your host, Oliver Gaucher. So at this point, I think we all know that YouTube videos, social media posts, and blog snippets will only get you so far. If you really want to develop the knowledge and skills you need to live regeneratively, you need the thorough information in a full book. Through their diverse range of publications, New Society Publishers' books explore topics that are at the forefront of creating positive change in our world. From regenerative agriculture and permaculture to social justice and eco-conscious living, their books cover a wide spectrum of subjects that empower readers to lead more regenerative and fulfilling lives. So whether you're a seasoned environmentalist, a curious beginner, or someone simply seeking inspiration and guidance on your journey towards regenerative living, New Society Publishers is here to support you every step of the way. If you subscribe right now to their newsletter at nuisances.com, you'll be the first to receive sneak peeks at new content and get discounts on upcoming title releases. You'll even get an exclusive discount code on their first purchase of books, ebooks, or audiobooks. So sign up today at nuisances.com. Hey there everybody and welcome back. So today I'm going to be kicking off another little series on a topic that's new to this show, which is that of regenerative tourism. Now, both I and a number of friends have been noticing a growing animosity and backlash towards tourism in our communities over the last couple of years. It seems that since the rise of short-term rentals and the post-COVID surge of travel, we're collectively hitting a tipping point in what local communities are willing to put up with as more of their culture and their way of life are overrun by outside visitors and the industries that cater to them. Now, obviously, I'm a foreigner to the place where I live, as are many of my friends in different places around the world. So I want to understand this cultural moment from a number of different perspectives. One being how people like myself can go beyond the empty promises of sustainable tourism and visit new places in a way that actually enriches the culture and identity of those locations. And also the other side, where as host communities, we can cultivate a relationship and cater to visitors in a way that incentivizes this kind of interaction and goes beyond the extractive tendencies from both sides. Now, I'm very new to the nuances of this topic, but thankfully my friend Charles Van de Kerkhof, who has made this topic his specialty for a number of years, has been kind enough to connect me to some of his contacts and to guide the questions and the concepts in the interviews of this growing series. And you'll hear from him more directly very soon. Now, this first interview will help to set the tone and offer an overview of what we're going to try and explore here. And I feel very fortunate to have gotten a hold of Michelle Holliday to start us off. Now, Michelle is an author, facilitator, consultant, and researcher who for the past 2 decades has supported pioneering clients across a range of sectors, including tourism and agriculture, to enable the transition to more regenerative systems and structures. Michelle's research and experience are brought together in her book, The Age of Thrivability: Vital Perspectives and Practices for a Better World, as well as more than 100 articles on themes of thrivability and regeneration. Now, in this conversation, Michelle and I start by building an understanding of her term thrivability as a concept that we set as a foundation for potential. We then look at the current paradigm of tourism and how it can erode both the value of the places that host visitors as well as cheapen the experiences that travelers are looking for. Now, through examples from our own travels and experiences, Michelle and I look through examples of tourism interactions from different places where opportunities may have been missed. We analyze both the perspectives of travelers as well as hosts to build a concept of thrivability for both. And Michelle also shares case studies where community-led discussions have unlocked greater potential than what may lie on the surface. Now, by the end, you'll also hear about ideas and advice on how you, whether as a visitor or a host, can break free of the common narrative of extractive tourism and begin to cultivate a relationship with the other that can enrich everyone involved, including the local environment. Now, with that as our preamble, I'll hand things over now to Michelle Holliday. Welcome, Michelle. Thank you so much for making time today. It's a pleasure. I'm so glad we were finally able to make this happen after a number of runarounds. But I'm excited to have you today, and I want to start with this term that I've seen come up in some of your writing and your speaking, and that features heavily in what you promote, which is that of thrivability. Can you explain to me what you mean by that term?
Yes, thanks for asking, and thanks for inviting me, Oliver. So thrivability is what it sounds like. focusing on the ability to thrive for people, for projects, for organizations as living ecologies, which is quite a different view from the kind of dominant mainstream way of seeing organizations. So focusing on the ability for the organization to thrive, for the community to be able to thrive, for the biosphere. And I started to focus on this, on thrivability in my work after seeing that for more than 50 years, we have struggled to implement even the most basic sustainability measures, even though we know they're needed. And so what I concluded is that we actually need an even bigger story, an expanded intention in order to generate the collective will that's needed and the cohesion that we need to come together around large and small problems and to develop the collaborative capacity. So that's the sort of thinking and it's my experience as well that sustainability is vital, but it's too small a concept to bring us together and doesn't shift the story, the underlying story enough. So we need the inspiration of that goal of enabling life to thrive, but we also need the guidance of a living systems perspective that thrivability also offers. That if we are living systems, if our projects and organizations and communities and even economies are living systems, then there's information there. And it leads us to regeneration, which I know is your focus as well.
I really am glad that you focused on the contrast of that terminology. It's clear that the concept of sustainability has failed to really inspire people. And even for someone who works all the time in this industry from various different levels in the agri-food system, in regenerative agriculture, in property design and such, I find it obnoxious. I hear
Mm-hmm.
it and I'm like, oh, well, okay, come on.
Right.
Define, first of all, what are we trying to sustain? There is a
Mm-hmm.
lack of an understanding, and it carries with it, at least from what I've observed, this assumption that everything is fine, we just need to
Mm-hmm.
consume in balance. And
Yes.
that's obviously not sufficient for the challenges that we face, for the problems that are incurring into our communities, to our lives in many different levels.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk about some maybe tangible examples? Because I definitely get the concept or the theory of thriving. Can you tell me maybe something that would illustrate a clear lack of thriving or something that is emblematic to you of a thriving system or an entity?
Hmm. So there's a real intention behind talking about thrivability, even more than thriving, because thriving is subjective and can often be rejected as something utopian. We haven't even managed sustainability yet, and you want us to get to thriving. Or there are people who don't even have food, and I should dream of thriving, or I'm just struggling to survive. I can't even think about thriving. And I've sort of made light reference to the story that we have now, the mechanistic, reductionist, extractive paradigm that guides our lives. And it would tell us that we're not worthy of thriving. So, thrivability is the ability right here, right now, to enable life to thrive. So, we could ask, what would add more ability to thrive to this conversation?
Mm,
What would make it more likely to generate new possibilities, more likely to be nourishing to us? And if we speak the same language, it's nice that we can see each other, even though listeners can't. If we could be together in a beautiful place, that would generate even more life and ability to thrive. If we take turns, if we have some protocols of respect, if we developed a friendship, then
yeah, yeah.
that would add to the ability to thrive within the container of this conversation. If we talk about something really meaningful, then it's likely, more likely, it will be more a fertile condition, right,
Sure. Yeah,
for
yeah.
life to be able to thrive. And really, life is conversation, especially human endeavor. It's always conversation. So this is a tiny example, this conversation, but we can extrapolate to almost everything and bring that intention, bring that consideration, that design. I talk about life's universal design principles, that we want to nourish the parts. So you and me, we each want to thrive. So we can ask what would enable each of us individually to bring our gifts and contributions, our unique perspectives. And there's also relationships. So the protocols of how we make decisions, how we share information, how we're in discovery together, we can design for more flow. Whether there's wholeness that emerges from the parts in those relationships, we can ask what brings us together. Could we talk about something really meaningful? We can design for that. And then the fourth principle, design principle, is that there is life. We are not machines only. There are mechanistic properties to every living system, but there's also life. There's also mystery and something that's too complex to know fully or to predict or control, and yet we can sense and respond. So in this conversation, we can be alert to where there's energy, where there's life, where there's something that we get excited about. We notice, ooh, let's go there. Let's talk about that. We didn't know that going in, but if we're stewards of this container that is our conversation, then we can follow that inspiration and cultivate the conditions for that to be just brought even more fully to life. And then the last part of these universal design principles is place, context. So we are sort of placeless in this Zoom call, but we can take in the context of the world right now. We can each bring in our own personal context. If we were in a community, then place would play a key role, and that's really powerful. So there's one small example, but we can apply it to everything.
I love that so much because very often people jump to examples of big things, and using the example of this conversation to me really shows how this line of thinking and this way of exploring potential in any scenario is a powerful way to unlock potential.
Mm-hmm.
I'm also curious too how this concept can be practiced or expressed in, let's say, clients that you work with, or
Mm-hmm.
yeah, your day-to-day, like in the labor space.
Yeah, yeah. It's relevant everywhere, but maybe I can share a couple of stories. I'll start with farming because I think that's near and dear to your heart
It
and
sure
maybe
is.
some of your listeners as well. I work with a community of farmers in Ontario who are making the transition from conventional to regenerative methods. And it started with two women. I think of them as matriarchs in the community. And very often it's some women of a certain age, not always, and not always women, but there's sort of a type who is paying attention to the health of the whole community, and who get together in someone's kitchen and say, are you seeing what I'm seeing? What should we do about it? And they do something. So these two women noticed that there was nothing to bring together all the farmers in the community. Church wasn't doing it anymore. There just infrastructure wasn't there. So everyone was isolated, and it's not only dangerous for individual farmers to be isolated. The mental health crisis among farmers is really terrible, but they need each other for tangible support and to learn. And so they realized all farmers care about soil. Everyone is dependent on soil, no matter what kind of farming you do, what your philosophy is. So they found a speaker to talk about soil. That speaker introduced them to regenerative approaches. So they organized an event. People came, lots of energy and excitement. So they followed that inspiration and did another event and another. And before you know it, it became a formal project with 28 farms and a project manager. They got funding from a foundation, and it became all about the metrics, soil health metrics and best practices. And if only farmers would follow the metrics, then they would change the behavior on their farms. And it was very rigid and not following those patterns of conversation that I just described. And there was no room for new ideas. And it slowly died as a project. It was this mechanistic prediction and control kind of approach. And so, and the land didn't get regenerated. People weren't able to learn what they needed to learn. And so these two women kind of went back to the kitchen and said, what should we try instead? And this is, I don't mean to take credit for it, but this is when I entered the scene. And we started to ask, what would soil do? What can we learn from life and living systems? And what if we see this community as an ecology that's also capable of generating new possibilities and of regeneration? And it's fascinating that soil has these patterns of living systems at play as well. There are diverse microorganisms, and we want to support as much of that diversity as possible. And there's one soil scientist who talks about the snot, slimes, and glues that those microorganisms emit, and
Yep.
that aggregates, that creates tunnels and passageways and allows the flow of relationship and nutrients and oxygen and water. And that when there's enough diversity and there's enough flow of relationship and supportive infrastructure, then there's this thing called quorum sensing,
Mhm.
where there's a phase shift. There's a shift in capability and characteristics so that it's not just a bunch of microorganisms in dirt anymore. It's soil. It's this living system, this whole living system that is soil that now can grow plants, can hold water, can draw carbon out of the atmosphere. And all of that is self-organizing. It's not the farmer who is kind of choreographing this, but the farmer can participate in that. And that's a real shift in role and relationship and understanding. So we brought this story and we explored ways that they can take inspiration from soil. So these two women gathered a small group of stewards who could cultivate the soil of community, who could host conversations in similar ways that I was describing with similar thoughtfulness, so that these farmers could be together in shared learning and mutual support and courage. It takes courage to change how you farm, how you do anything. And so, as a result of their efforts to cultivate the soil of community, it's now more than 100 farms, 100 farmers together. It's this incredibly vibrant learning ecology. They find that the farmers are no longer isolated, that there's now a culture of learning and curiosity and change. They find that the community is vibrant and more inclusive than ever. They find that there is, importantly, a steady stream of new self-initiated, individually initiated, but community-sustained initiatives in support of soil health and more. So it's this very generative community, and the soil itself is getting regenerated. And so are people. It's a very healing experience for the people as well. So there's one example of my work.
That is, like you said, very dear to my heart. As the coordinator of the climate farmers community for Regen Ag around Europe, I have many parallel stories to that and have seen some incredible transformations of communities that gather around these connecting elements in our shared resource base, soil often being one of them. And those metaphors that you used for analogies that are perfectly parallel to what we see in healthy, connected communities, both below ground and above, can really help to create an awareness for the importance of nurturing those connections and basing them on deeper relationships. Now, I want to
Hmm.
go from that idea into tourism,
Hmm.
because
Hmm.
this is part of a focus that I am very new to. I've participated as a tourist, certainly. I've lived in communities that receive a lot of tourism. But can you talk to me about the current paradigm that we see in the tourism industry and how, well, maybe we won't go as far as to how to start making changes yet, but let's use that as a basis to build the conversation on.
Sure. It's really parallel in many ways to that shift in farming. It's important that you named it as the tourism industry, and it really is perceived as something factory-like, something mechanistic. And I often describe it as a conveyor belt, that the goal is to move as many people, as many grabbing, demanding tourists through a place as possible, as quickly as possible, and shake as much money loose from their pockets as we can along the way. And it is fundamentally a process of extraction from those tourists, but also extraction from that place. How can we get as much value as possible? And there's a lot of celebration of the jobs that are created and the economic benefit, but there's more and more awareness of this concept of economic leakage, that very often the money actually doesn't stay in the community, but the costs all do. The cost of paving over things to create more parking, and of rising housing costs because of Airbnb and other things, and the cost of adding water processing, sewage capacity, all of those costs do stay in the community, and money often goes to some corporation somewhere else. And the cost of culture loss, as well as this conveyor belt, and the idea of more and speed and efficiency always being better, means that we move ever towards the generic. So we lose culture. So that's what we have now.
Well, I think that's reflective of so many other, let's say, quote unquote, industries or facets of our economy. And we're operating on a presumption that economic gain is somehow enough to justify all the other things that are lost, right? Cultural loss is very analogous to biodiversity loss, the great simplification of things and the homogeneity of basically everything that would otherwise make a place unique. I've often reflected to my friends, because I've spent, well, really most of my life traveling, not necessarily in like a tourism capacity. Oftentimes it was for work or for other reasons, but we've certainly gotten to a point, especially in cities and population centers, where I could be almost anywhere in the globe and feel like I'm in the same place, right? You have the same chain restaurants, you have the same general layouts, many of them being leftovers from colonial eras, right?
Yes.
And this homogeneity has really taken the soul, and to assume that an economic boom from these changes is enough to justify them is clearly come to its limits. I right now live very close to Barcelona and the Costa Brava and the Costa del Sol down the further south of the Mediterranean, a place that within the last year has seen quite a few protests from people against the concept of tourism, as some of the most emblematic neighborhoods of these places have been turned into short-term rentals, Airbnbs and such, that price out people who used to make those places their home. Many of the small fishing villages that, you know, were very simple, humble, lived off the economy of the sea, have been completely swarmed with seasonal tourism and are completely dead outside of that season now. And it's got to a tipping point where there have been some major proposals for changing these things, and I am not up to date on it. I am fortunately in a very small town that almost unanimously rejects the concept of promoting this area for tourism, despite how beautiful it is. And I absolutely sympathize with my neighbors here who don't want this to be overrun by people who simply use it for a period of time, leave their trash, and go on their way at the rest of the year. So with that as a backdrop, what are the alternatives? What's the potential? Because people are not going to start staying home right now. Certainly after the pandemic, everybody is very keen to get moving again. And as much as there is a backlash to these things, are there solutions?
I think there are, and I think it's reflected in this new phrase that has become kind of a buzz phrase, I guess, regenerative tourism, which is maybe how we've gotten connected around this. But very few people know what that could mean, even. And the assumption in the phrase is that it has something to do with the tourist. And what I bring to communities is the perspective that regeneration is a synonym for healing and more, but kind of the shorthand for it is that it's about healing, and what needs to be healed is people and place. That it's us in our places. It's Barcelona, that needs healing in its biodiversity, in its culture, in the livelihoods of the people there, even in its economic well-being. And that healing is not the job or the responsibility or even the possibility of the tourist. That's our work, to heal ourselves, to determine together what is it that needs to be healed and what could that look like. So I offer the shift away from this concept of tourism that has baked in it so much of the extractive mentality and invite people to connect with hosting. Hosting, doesn't it come down to that? Isn't that what is really at the heart of this urge we have to travel and be together? And everyone in a community is a host of each other, one way or another, and everyone is hosted by this place. So can we come together as a community and explore what this place means to us? What is this place that is our home? And how are we already well hosted here? How do we host each other? How would we love to be hosted and host each other here? What is the story that wants to unfold here? So it's again conversation. So I host people in community in meaningful conversation about home and hosting to help them discover that story, to help them design ways of being together to enact that story, to bring it to life. And then they can decide how they would like to invite others on their own terms into what story of healing, what unfolding story of healing and generativity, so that these visitors can then contribute, play a part in that, and be healed themselves, bring that back to their own communities. So that's my offering to shifting the dynamic of tourism, shifting it to home and hosting and something that's truly community led.
Yeah. And hosting has such deep cultural roots as well. I know it's
Yeah.
fundamental to so many of the places where I have been hosted. I
Yeah.
think almost always back to North African and Middle Eastern communities as being the prime example for me of this cultural rooted concept of hosting being so ingrained that
Hmm.
it just there's a depth of generosity there that I've rarely
Yes.
experienced in other places.
Yes.
And when you think about it too, these are not necessarily the most affluent communities by any means. And
No.
these cultural narratives have informed that way of, I mean, let's face it, many of these areas come from nomadic cultures and histories as well. And so
Yeah.
as people pass through regularly, those few who stay put have, I don't want to try and simplify this or explain it in terms that I'm not, probably qualified to dissect, but in areas where transience has been a large part of the history, I've also found that this concept of being a good host and treating visitors as honored guests is very present. And that isn't to say that there is an allowance or turning an eye to any kind of extraction or abuse of that relationship. There is an expectation that one would be a gracious host as well, or sorry, a
Mhm.
gracious visitor as well. Do you have other examples? I mean, I'm thinking right now to the article on the Thrivability website of Visit Flanders and the
Mm.
work that was done there. Maybe we can use that as a case study and unpack it a little bit for the modern context.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to touch on something that you were just saying. In many languages, the word guest and the word host are the same word.
Hmm.
There's something interesting about how we're always hosting each other. And so that recognition invites reciprocity, it invites respect. Yeah. So one of my favorite stories out of Flanders is from some years ago when the region that's famous for Flanders Fields was preparing for the 100-year anniversary of World War One. And the Destination Management Organization. So around the world, every area has this semi-government infrastructure where there's a local destination management organization, there's a regional tourism management organization, and a national. So the local organization that is dedicated to growing, to developing the tourism industry. Like, and the name says it all, like destination management, as if a place can be managed by some small team, and all its complexity. So the Destination Management Organization was doing all the right things according to the textbook of destination management to prepare for this 100-year anniversary. They thought that many millions of people would come, and so they were creating a brand identity for this event, and they were making sure that the road signs and other signs were in place and that there would be enough hotel capacity and that sort of thing. Everything seemed to be going well. And then at one point, someone wrote an article in a local newspaper that said, what they are doing is terrible. This is not Disney. This is not something that you brand and you market and you do crowd control with all of the, the lines and everything. This is a tragedy. This is something where so many people died here, and this is not right. And so, to this team's credit, they stopped everything and they brought the community together. And they asked, do we want to do this? As your community has asked, is this something we want to do? And if so, what would make it okay? What would it have to look like for it to be the right thing to do? And together as a community, they came up with, through a process of conversation, they came up with 7 sacred principles. They call them sacred principles. And the first one is respect, that this should be done with profound respect for the tragedy, for the dead, for 600,000 dead, people who died in this region. And part of what that meant to them was there should be no talk of winners and losers. Everyone loses in a war. And there should be accuracy in how we tell the story. Like, we should know the historical facts. And one thing that resulted from that is that someone offered history lessons available to anyone, and hundreds of citizens signed up for these free history lessons because everyone felt that they were a host. You could be sitting on the bus, you could be walking to the store, and some visitor might ask you what happened here. So there was such a sense of cohesion and hosting and stewardship of this. And so it kind of parallels the farmers, where individuals were able to bring their ideas, like the history lessons. Somebody was giving poppy seeds to visitors. And at one point, the tourism office's social media was all red because people took those poppy seeds back, planted them in their own gardens, and then shared the pictures with Visit Flanders, And there's one beautiful image of a vigil at dusk. There's just a bit of light left, and there is this line of people, as far as you can see, standing along a significant line of battle. And each person is holding a torch with a flame at the top. And to see the faces, and then also to see it from above, and to feel how wide that line of battle was, and what that must have been like, and what it must have been like to stand there in modern times, in cohesion, in solidarity with your neighbors and maybe some visitors as well. So it was very generative of new ideas, and very regenerative, very healing for the people there, for all who visited, made more possible in that community, I would imagine. And their whole intention behind these sacred principles was to support peace. It wasn't to celebrate the war. It was to make peace more likely. So that, as a cohering purpose, was powerful and important. So there's another example.
I love that. And one of the things that seemed to have catalyzed this is that the board that was in charge of doing the promotion and the communication first listened, right?
Yes.
It does seem like so many times that is a first step that is so easily overlooked, where we jump to conclusions, or we do our own research and we make assumptions and we act on those without making space for really listening and paying attention, or observing what the response, what the other ideas from the people who are involved in this, whether they do so consciously or not, have to say or would like to see as a result.
Mm-hmm.
Could you make some recommendations about how to make space to listen and observe when you may find yourself either in charge of organization of an event, or part of a tourism board, or anything else that would be involved in shifting from being a place of tourism to a host?
Yeah, it's such a good question. It goes back to farming, to permaculture. First, listen. First, pay attention for a year
And
if you,
interact, yeah.
right? So this you're touching on the key thing, the one thing, curiosity, to be open, to be humble. And then from there, in fact, I'm going to name a set of practices that I bring. It starts with new ways of seeing. So seeing that it's not a machine, that it's not something that you can predict and control, but that it has a life of its own, it being the community or the project. So I find that an important foundation to that curiosity. If, yeah, if I recognize that there's more here than I can predict and control, then I'm more likely to be curious and listening. And then new ways of being. That means I show up differently. I develop practices for listening, for attuning to what might be emerging. Maybe I meditate or I journal or I spend time in nature. Then there's new ways of interacting. So there are really tangible methods for listening well together as a community. We can be in meaningful dialogue. We can sit in a circle and each take turns. Like that's the most ancient and basic method of interacting and of listening well, not only to what I think, and not only to what you think, but to what we think. This is the sort of thing that Flanders community did to discover those sacred principles. That wasn't some leader getting buy-in on their vision. That was truly emergent. And then there's with new ways of seeing and being as a steward and new ways of interacting where we really are listening to each other and to life, then we can imagine new ways of serving. Not just get as many tourists through as possible, but could we serve peace through this? They couldn't imagine that until they could see differently, until they could show up differently, until they could be in conversation differently. And only then could that new possibility come into view. And then new ways of acting. And here I talk about having an experimental orientation, kind of be agile, do what is good enough for now and safe enough to try. Somebody wants to give away poppy seeds, awesome. As long as it doesn't counteract any of those sacred principles. But if you feel some urge and you are aligned with these principles, then go for it. Then we need new ways of sensing. And this is an answer to the mechanistic stories mantra that if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. You know, like we have to go beyond only the things that we can measure. How will we know that we are serving peace, that we are each nourished? And then finally, new ways of learning together, that we need to come back together and tell stories and celebrate in order to integrate and evolve and grow. So that's a really long answer to the how, but start anywhere in there, wherever you feel.
Look back to another part that you were talking about earlier, which is understanding the context in which things are unfolding or are operating, right?
Yeah.
And only through listening and co-creating an understanding of that context, which is something that is very central to my work and that we talk about constantly in these groups with farmers on their transition journeys. It really dictates not only what is possible, but also what your metrics for success are, right?
Yeah.
If there can be a consensus, if there can be a general vision within the communities that are hosting about what looks like success from doing these things, then we can make adjustments. We can fine tune or correct course based on evolving understanding, because it might not be the same definition of success for one event as it is for another, or for an overarching vision of what the community wants to host based on the resources and the limitations that it is able to take on, right?
Exactly.
Or can you give some examples about how the definition or the evolution of a context has informed the way that communities or specific places have chosen to host people? Do you have any examples for that?
About how the context has evolved and therefore the response has evolved?
Or informed the response or the management of how they deal with the resources and the presence in their community.
It's a good question. I'm struggling to think of one in particular, in part because it's so baked into this work that it's a constant emergence and evolution. So every time we get together, it's new. There's
Right.
there's a new response. I think about the farmers that I was describing earlier, and I remember one conversation where they had just held a farmers forum, and it was something around innovation. And they said, did you notice there was so much energy around this concept of innovation? Maybe that's really key. Maybe we always need to hold that as a consistent thread because it holds so much life and possibility. So they hadn't had that focus before. It just sort of came up and someone noticed it, in the context. And so is that the sort of thing you're looking for?
Yeah, I guess that's one. I'm also trying to get to, there are, through the principles and the patterns that you outlined previously, do you have an idea about what could potentially make a more conscious form of hosting and of travel the norm?
Mm. Yes. I talk often about the need for practice grounds, that we have so few places in modern society where we can be in the practice of relationship, of wholeness, of being with complexity and difference and change, and knowing that we have the skills to navigate that, knowing that we can trust in ourselves, trust in life, trust in each other. And so maybe that was faith communities in the past, and maybe in some places it still is, or the town square, and cohesive communities could hold us in that practice of being with emergence and change and evolution. We don't have that as much as maybe we used to. And so I often talk with organizational leaders to say, this is maybe your highest calling, to create your organization or your community as this kind of practice ground. Like there are layers of benefit and meaning and purpose here. One of them is to create a microcosm of society where we can learn how to be generative, be regenerative together. So I think that's it. Like, some people have to step up to that role and convene the community. And the reason I'm so excited about tourism is there is that infrastructure that I described. Everywhere in the world, there are people at the local and regional and national level who are responsible for cultivating the well-being of this place. They're not currently thinking of it in those terms. They're thinking conveyor belt, but it doesn't take much. These are people generally who care a lot. In fact, I was describing the farmer story and the whole matriarch thing to some people in tourism recently, and they said, that's us too. So many people in tourism are women who care about the whole community, So there's infrastructure and therefore funding for these people and their work. They care about the community. Tourism touches everything. It touches culture, it touches history, it touches infrastructure, business, law, government. And fundamentally, it's grounded in really meaningful concepts like home and belonging and creativity. What could we do if people were here, or for each other? Could we give poppy seeds? Could we do a vigil? Wouldn't that be meaningful? And we can do that for ourselves, and we can invite others in. So I'm excited to help people in tourism step into that role that they can play and that generally they have permission to play. They're outside of politics, but they have sort of the right to convene people around what home means to us and what hosting means to us. So to create a practice ground, but anybody can do it. You're doing it as well. I think this is such important work right now, especially as we're polarized, especially as there's rising fascism that is beyond our ability, you and me, to counteract, but we can create a better society in our neighborhoods, in our organizations, in our communities.
Yeah, absolutely. I am completely convinced increasingly that this ego-driven mindset of trying to solve global problems really extracts our valuable energy and attention from the things that are happening right around us. And I have been just as guilty as anybody of putting a lot of energy into big concepts and large movements without, or definitely at the expense of, the attention and the care, the stewardship that I was able otherwise to put into my own home, my family, my community around me. And I'm really hoping to make that shift increasingly. And something that I talk about a lot here in this space as well. So I'm really glad you mentioned it there. What considerations should listeners keep in mind when they're planning their next trip? Or if, let's say, they work in the tourism sector where they live, how they could take an active role in co-creating a different potential, not only as tourists themselves, but potentially as hosts too.
Well, there are some kind of logistical things. The more time you can spend, generally, the better. The less impact your travel, your transportation has, and the more you're able to be both a guest and a host, to really be transformed by that experience, by that place, and maybe offer something to the place as well. I would also look for stories. Let yourself be drawn to real people and stories, and go in pilgrimage, more than as a tourist. Go as a pilgrim in honor of that story and that uniqueness. I'm in Canada, and there's a beautiful magazine put out by a travel agency. They will help you organize your travel in Canada. And they put out a magazine called Northern Soul. And it's so rich with stories of people and place. So that's the sort of thing I would look for. Look for the rich stories so that you come with respect. You come able to contribute, to participate in the story of healing that's happening in that place. What do you think, Oliver? What are your thoughts about good travel? You said you travel quite a lot.
Yeah. I absolutely agree with what you said. Slower travel. I mean, there's an organization by that name too. Really look at the potential for building relationships. That is something that permeates so much of what I do and what I advise on with clients and such too, that this is a process of building deeper relationships. And only through those insights and those connections are you going to have an idea of what your contributions might be able to be. It's something you're just taking shots at the dark end. If you're blazing through a place, seeing the sights, going through, visiting a restaurant and getting out of there, right? But if you can, find a way to endear yourself and visit someone in their home, hear their stories, like you said, that is a great first way to start building relationships. And not being in a hurry is also a good way to do that. And of course, it comes back to what we were talking about of listening keenly. Now, of course, it depends on what particular objective you might have for your travel, if it's relaxation or whatnot. In my case, it's often been for education. I've traveled a lot for courses, and there's just so much beautiful artistry and cultural practices that have informed a lot of what I do. And that is a great way to build relationship, because so many communities are fighting to keep those types of artists and crafts or ways of knowing alive. And maybe it's a little bit self-righteous, but I do think that there is a meaningful contribution in honoring the value of that knowledge and those practices by taking the time to learn them and to show an appreciation for the person who has, dedicated their time to mastery and to teaching those as well. Those have been many of my most enriching experiences. And I can think back to the exact trip and where I made the decision, instead of going around and seeing the sights, but to just stay in one place, which was not particularly touristy at all. And that is when I learned Spanish. That's where I stayed, in the second largest city in Guatemala, called Xelajú, to the indigenous name there. And that is in no indirect way the reason why I have a long-term partner who I communicate with mostly in Spanish, and have lived quite a long time and worked and participated in communities in Guatemala for a number of years previously, and has brought me to the situation where I am now in Catalonia, where Spanish is the main language in which I make connections, but also opens up the new challenge that I have now of learning Catalan, because here in central Catalonia, this is an extremely protective community that is proud of their small regional language and has gone to great lengths to preserve it. And I absolutely want to honor that effort. To me, it's analogous to, the biodiversity that we've talked about and the loss of culture. And so if I plan on putting down roots here and participating in this community, it's only right that I learn to communicate in the way that the people here do as well. So that maybe went a little bit beyond the question, but these are the ways that I've been interpreting these and working on participating and being a better, I would say, well, traveler to a certain degree, but now that I'm putting down roots, the role is shifting. And also because I've traveled so much in my life now that I have a farm and a place to host people, trying to internalize what that concept means and how that can be integrated into the culture of what we're trying to build in the space and the farm here, right? So the food that we grow, being able to offer that to people who spend time here and creating an inviting space that allows people to flourish and accomplish what they're hoping to get out of these experiences. Something that I think about a lot right now as we're in the renovations of some of these historic places, which at the same time require a lot of reverence for all of the generations of people who participated, lived lives in this home. And I mean, this house was presumably built in the 8th century. So there is an immense amount of history and a deep sense of responsibility that I feel in taking care of this place and as well making it available and leaving it better for inevitably the other generations of people who will participate and have lives here after me. So yeah, it's something I think about a lot.
Love it.
Yeah.
Love it.
Now, before we wrap up, Michelle, can you tell us about your book? So The Age of Thrivability, Vital Perspectives and Practices for a Better World. Obviously, you go into much more detail about many of the concepts that we explored here today. And even though our focus today was on tourism, I know that you've explored many other different sectors through these concepts as well. Can you give us a little overview of that?
This book was my effort to point to the dominant story, that mechanistic, reductionist, extractive worldview that guides so much of our lives, and to point also to signs that there's a bigger story emerging, a more life-aligned worldview, and that we're trying to move into an age of thrivability. We don't really have a name for this era. There's the hunter-gatherer era, the agrarian era, the industrial era. We don't really know what this one is. Maybe it's information age, but I think there's more than the tools behind each of those eras. It's also about the consciousness and the worldview. So the book is really describing that shift and how it shows up in many different ways. My hope is that it offers courage and inspiration. My perspective on this authoritarian wave is that it is that dominant worldview having a temper tantrum, not wanting to give up. And it's a lack of imagination that some people can't yet see that even more and even better is possible. So it's not guaranteed that we will find our way into an age of thrivability, but there are so many signs that are really encouraging. And if more of us are aware of it and more of us can be intentional to cultivate practice grounds and to grow from there, to connect those practice grounds and expand them, then we can demonstrate that more and better is possible. I think it's certainly not easy to convince someone intellectually to give up that outgoing story. But when you live something, when you experience a vibrant, generative community, then something starts to open up. So that's the hope behind the book.
Beautiful. And how can listeners learn more about your work, visit your websites, and get in touch with you?
So I have 2 websites. One is just me, michelleholiday.com, and you can learn about my own story and work there. And then recently I launched a site called thrivableworld.com. It has some resources and information there, and the intention is to grow it into a community of practice, really, with other contributors. Already there's a collaborator there as well, but I'm offering some core principles, but there's just so much that is aligned, that is telling a similar story but in different ways. There are different methods. So my hope is that it will be a gathering place for this kind of work.
Wonderful. Well, Michelle, thank you so much for taking the time today. This was a really enriching conversation. I'm so glad that we got through all of the hurdles that it took to schedule this. It was very much worthwhile. I want to thank you again for taking the time today, and I look forward to being in touch in the future.
Thank you. I do too. Thanks, Oliver.
Now, before we wrap this up, just remember that these episodes are only the beginning of the learning resources, design and coaching services, in-person courses, and interactive community that are available through Regenerative Skills. The Discord server is our free community where you can connect with other like-minded listeners, exchange ideas, stories, tips, and resources, as well as interact with me directly and quite a few former guests from this show. Our Instagram account @regen_skills is the best place to see the projects that me and the team are working on, both for clients and collaborators, as well as on our own properties. I'll also be announcing the certification courses, workshops, and gatherings that we've got coming up later this year. If you're interested in getting dedicated support for your own project, you can now schedule a free planning session with one of our team members through the request form on our website. You can also find all the links, show notes, and past resources there at regenerativeskills.com. We truly believe that no matter your experience, your knowledge, abilities, resources, or background, you can be a powerful force for regeneration on this planet, and we're here to help you find your path. So as always, remember to keep taking those little steps every day towards a regenerative future, and I'll be right by your side along the way.